Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone on the call, depending on where you are calling in from. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 12th webinar in our local and subnational government information series. And this is in relation to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So thank you for joining in. Before we start, I just want to mention that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available in a follow-up email to all participants and everyone who registered, along with any relevant resources that are mentioned throughout the webinar by our exciting lineup of panelists that I will introduce in a second. So a very warm welcome from ICLEI and from ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre. We are so privileged to have you on the line with us today. Today's topic, we are changing gear in a sense. Rather than looking at biodiversity and the roadmap in its strictest sense, we're broadening the scope of the webinar today, and we're hoping that everyone will be really excited in terms of the new sort of topics we're going to start moving into. And this is obviously in relation to the need to mainstream nature across key sectors in our society. And specifically, we're going to be looking today at a few of the sort of nexus issues around nature, food, nutrition, and health, and specifically how these are all coming to the fore in the time of COVID-19. And then, bringing it back to what this means for local and subnational governments, and obviously in relation to the post-2020 framework. We're really excited to have some really exciting speakers on the line with us. And we're going to start exploring these nexus issues. We know that nature is critical for many aspects of our increasingly urban lives. And we know that nature underpins our ability to have cities and build cities that are food secure, where societies have access to nutritious food. And also nature is the foundation of cities that are healthy and livable for our people. So again, just a warm welcome from me. And to situate this webinar, I always show this visual just to say that we are in what is a critical moment. It was the super year for nature, but this has been extended with a few of the delays in the official events on the roadmap to COP15, which will now likely take place in 2021. So before I cover the agenda, I just want to introduce myself. I will be moderating the webinar, and my name is Timothy Blatch. I'm a professional officer at ICLEI Africa and also the Global Coordinator for Cities with Nature. For those who attend the webinars regularly, I will not be a stranger to you. I would also really like to give a very warm welcome to our lineup of speakers and our panelists. We have David Maddox with us today, and he's the Executive Director of the Nature of Cities. We also have Mr. Oliver Hilal, who is, again, no stranger to this webinar series, and we always appreciate his insights from the SCBD point of view. And Oliver is the Program Officer at the SCBD. We also have Ingrid, who you all know very well, and Ingrid is the Senior Manager for Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions and Senior Program Manager at ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre. We have a new face today who we're really excited to have online with us, and that is Paul Curry. And Paul is a Senior Professional Officer for Urban Systems at ICLEI Africa, and will bring a very exciting and new perspective to the conversation. So with that, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all our panelists and quickly run through the agenda. I've covered the opening and welcome. I will then quickly do an update on the roadmap timeline and then the Edinburgh process, which excitingly is currently underway. And thereafter, I'll hand over to Ingrid to do a bit of an introduction. Why are we talking nature, health, and food and this nexus, and how does this relate to the post-2020 framework? After which I will play a pre-recording. Oliver's unable to join us live in this morning's session, but I've got a pre-recording of his that we will show on nature and health from the perspective of the SCBD. Before I will hand over to David Maddox. He also is unable to join us because of time differences. It's the middle of the night for him, unfortunately. He will join us live this afternoon, but I've got a pre-recording that David kindly agreed to do that we will play. And David will also be looking at the COVID nature and health issues from a very practical point of view that we're really excited to share with you all today. And then I will hand over last but not least to Paul Curry, who will be discussing healthy food and healthy nature and giving us some great examples from the work that ICLEI Africa is doing in this regard. Thereafter, I will open for some questions and discussions. And just to note at this point, there's two ways in which you can ask questions. Please feel free to make use of the chat box throughout the webinar. Alternatively, you can wait right until the end. Once kindly ask that we wait until all the presentations have been delivered. Thereafter, you can either raise your hand in the panel on the right or make use of the chat box at that time. So just to say that this webinar is brought to you on behalf of the Global Task Force, for which ICLEI is the focal point to the CBD. And also to situate the webinar within our broader series, this is the fourth webinar of the year and the 12th webinar in the series, but here are available all the dates and registration links for the upcoming webinars, which we will also share with you in a follow-up email. So very briefly, we're not going to go through the timeline in detail because very little has changed since the last webinar. But I think just to note that we are currently in the Edinburgh process that you can see just to the right of the little red star where we are now. We are still working up to some major UN events, and again, these timelines are not static. They're open to change as the global environment is changing, and we need to adapt. But for now, SABSTA and SBI after the Edinburgh process will be the next upcoming events. As well as I'd also like to bring your attention to Daring Cities, which will be happening as a 3-week virtual event now in October. And we will communicate those details to you when it's appropriate to do so. So very quickly, I want to just say that we are very excited as ICLEI to be an organizing partner in the Edinburgh process, the subnational consultation on the post-2020 framework. And for all those who have not registered to take part in this online virtual consultation, there's an email address on your screen now, and we encourage you to email that and express your interest, and thereafter you will be sent a registration link to take part. These are some of the partners who are involved in the Edinburgh process, and you can see ICLEI and a few of our core partners are all well represented. The aims of the Edinburgh process is to gather subnational views on the post-2020 framework and the monitoring framework and produce an Edinburgh process report. We will also be, we've undertaken with our partners a review of the plan of action, highlighting some of the gaps and issues, and we're consulting through the Edinburgh process to get inputs on the recommendations for inclusion in a stepped up and dedicated decision at COP15. Through the Edinburgh process, we're also developing what we call the Edinburgh Declaration and inviting inputs and support on that. And what the Edinburgh process is really trying to do is create a community that's working together towards COP15. And we are really excited to be piloting this through a virtual approach. As you know, the event was meant to take place in person, but due to COVID-19, we've transformed it into a really exciting online process. So on the Edinburgh process timeline, I just want to draw your attention to where we currently are. We held last week the first online regional information sessions, and these were hugely successful and held in each region to introduce the process and to explain how we will be running the consultation. So I hope for those of you who were able to join, I hope that the instructions are clear, and for those who were not able to join, it's not too late. The beauty of an online process is that registering will allow you to access the recordings, and you can very much still take part. I want to draw your attention to the red box at the top, that the online consultation is open right up until the 29th of May. So we really encourage you to get involved, have your say, and make your inputs. It's very easy to do so through a series of Google Forms. I want to also draw your attention to the red box at the bottom. There are a number of thematic webinars that complement the process that are happening throughout the month. The first of these has already taken place on Tuesday this week, where we looked at some monitoring and reporting tools for local and subnational governments in relation to the framework. But there are 4 very exciting webinars coming up, and the dates and links to register for those are all available on Attendify. And Attendify is the main platform being used to keep participants updated and to really stimulate discussion among the Edinburgh Process community. And this is really the central point where all information about the process will be shared, and registration allows you access to this. So again, we encourage you to register and take part. So on that note, we want to dive in and get started, and I just want to really thank Ingrid for her time and for being with us today. And Ingrid is going to provide a brief overview and introduction in terms of how nature, health and food relate to the post-2020 framework from a mainstreaming point of view. So Ingrid, thanks for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and you can move on to the next slide. And while you do that, I just want to say hello to everybody, whether it's morning or evening. And my role today is very brief. It's just to sort of set the scene and put this webinar into context. The whole point of talking about nature, health and food is located very much in the topicality around COVID-19, as Tim has mentioned. But it's also important to understand that this nexus is something that's very embedded in biodiversity mainstreaming, and has been, as you can see from some of those examples on the slide, for a very long time. In fact, the whole concept of mainstreaming is almost about 2 decades old now. And it's very interesting to see that from a very early stage, there's already been talk around the connections and the relationships between nature and the health and well-being of people on the one side, but also food and how that links with nutrition and food security to the condition of nature and also people. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is the One Health approach. This is something that comes from the World Health Organization, but has been inculcated into the CBD process with One Health approach guidelines and decisions, and these go back for a couple of years. And then the whole aspect of focusing on food and food security, nutrition, and the role it plays in human health and well-being is also something that has been the focus of the CBD's attention for a number of years, and there's a range of decisions. I've just highlighted some of the more important ones. And then when we come back to the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is what our advocacy efforts are focused on at the moment, the link there is, as Tim mentioned earlier, around biodiversity mainstreaming. And the important thing is that already in COP13, COP 5-6 years ago, the parties called on the CBD to make sure that biodiversity is also mainstreamed across the whole range of agriculture sectors. And then at COP14, which was held in Egypt in 2018, there was a very important decision which emphasized the link between health, biodiversity and cities by focusing specifically on the value of urban green spaces and the fact that these play an important role in our urban communities' well-being and health. And if you can move to the next slide, I'm going to just expand very briefly on 2 other big documents or important documents. The one is the Cancun Declaration on mainstreaming the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity for well-being. So here again, you can see very specific emphasis on health and well-being. And in this document, it made a very strong link to and emphasized the link between food security, nutrition, and human health. And then just to sort of close up this policy framework, I think probably the centrally most important one is the One Health approach. So as I said, this is an approach that is driven and comes from the World Health Organization, but which has been captured and embodied in the CBD process. And the important thing about this is what it does, as you can see from that little diagram in the right-hand corner, is it focuses on the interconnections between human and ecosystem health on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it is an interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral approach to this nexus. It's also important to keep in mind that it is consistent with the ecosystems approach, which is a fundamental approach within the CBD, in the convention. And when we think about how this all applies to cities, I think that the really important thing is that up till now, the emphasis has been on the impacts of urbanization and the access to green spaces, and specifically the health and well-being benefits of these. This does mean that there are various areas that we're seeing in more recent years that we need to strengthen. For example, it's more than just open green spaces. We need to think about the urban-rural linkages, the teleconnections, and we also need to think about the impacts of agriculture, specifically also within the context of urban agriculture. And I understand that we're going to have a presentation later on, which Paul will elaborate a bit more on those aspects. What it also does is that within the One Health approach, there's a set of very clear principles which guides all levels of government, including local and subnational governments, and it gives clear sort of indications as what sort of measures need to be applied on the ground and at the different levels of government to implement the One Health approach. You move next slide, please. I'm going to talk now a little bit, come back to bring you back into the sort of mainstreaming frame of mind. And the important thing about mainstreaming, and we have talked about this in the past, is that it has a very clear instruction also to deal with the, or to address mainstreaming within the context of the SDGs. And for the purposes of today's discussion, obviously SDG 2 and SDG 3, as well as the FAO mainstreaming platform, which I will talk about a little later. Now, the long-term approach to mainstreaming is currently being developed, and in its current draft format, it does mention contributions to local and subnational governments, and there are references to health and food, but the specific link between health, food, and local and subnational governments is not clearly articulated, and this needs to be strengthened. And I think this is where the constituency of local and subnational governments, through, for example, the Edinburgh Process, but also through participating in the various webinars that we have where you can make inputs, and also the other milestone events on the roadmap, is to make those links stronger and to be more articulate in terms of what we want from our constituency to ensure that there is effective implementation under the new global biodiversity framework. And if you can move on to the next slide. And I think while you do that, Tim, what the important thing is that given the context that we find ourselves today with this global pandemic, the links between nature, people, human health and well-being, and food and agriculture have become so much more important, and we need to get it right now. So just quickly to talk a little bit about the FAO mainstreaming platform, and just as an aside to mention that we hope in one of our future webinars to have some speakers from the FAO to elaborate more on this. The FAO has this platform which was launched at COP13, and essentially it facilitates dialogue and exchanges between various actors, including government, and they focus obviously on the restoration of biodiversity across the agricultural sectors. They've done a number of things. For example, they've held multi-stakeholder dialogues. They brought out a mainstreaming strategy, and it basically is a forum where policy and best practice is discussed and disseminated. And if we move into the last slide, I just want to do a little bit of an adversarial at this stage. We've just recently within ICLEI produced a document that provides an overview of what has been achieved under the current plan of action, which comes to an end this year, specifically in terms of how local and subnational governments have contributed to this biodiversity strategy and the convention. And this is a document that really is quite impressive in terms of what we have achieved in the past. There are certainly areas where we need to improve things, and there are gaps and omissions that we can strengthen. And through our advocacy process, we are hoping to do that now under the new Global Biodiversity Framework and a new dedicated decision. But the importance of this report is that it does provide a very strong and compelling case and evidence of what has already been achieved and how important our constituencies' contributions are in achieving global biodiversity agenda, and also contributing to the SDGs, etc. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Tim and say thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ingrid, and thank you for your contributions. I think you've done a really good job of situating why we're moving into these different thematic areas. And I think it's really important for us to be considering these connections as we are increasingly seeing these play out, especially in and around our cities. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Oliver, who I'm sure by now you all know. And Oliver's going to give us a bit of a pre-recorded presentation. And I'm going to play his inputs around nature and health from the perspective of the SCBD.
Hello to all of you. It's a pleasure to be on this webinar with you. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you personally, but I will follow up with your feedback from this webinar. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the perspective of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity in relation to the two aspects of nature and health of the wider theme in the context of food and nutrition as well. But the fact is that the issue of the current pandemic and the associated economic crisis has increased a lot the interest on the links between biodiversity and human health as a critical component of mainstreaming in general. And for the convention, this has certain implications that I'd like to highlight here, particularly in light of the subnational and local constituency. So first, it's important to know that when we talk about the so-called health sector in the CBD, we mean both the policies related to the integration of nature into health, but also, and the provision of health services and the avoidance of disease, but also on the other hand, there is the whole public-private interaction and incentives and partnerships related to the so-called private sector health. What is that private sector? It is the pharmaceutical industry, it is the medical industry as well, and it is the provision of health and insurance services, but it also is the delivery of hygienic standards that we are seeing all over in terms of consumption of food. And this requires national governments to be involved with all other players, including, and we have seen that so very much now, subnational and local governments. So we, of course, in the Secretariat will work with the World Health Organization as a specialized UN agency dealing with this. And there is an item in our 24th meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. Agenda item 9 will be looking at that. So this will come up. It's also important to know that there are many clear connections that link mainstreaming with the provision of nature's benefits and the risks to people. The wise management of human-nature interactions, particularly in cities where poverty and unsustainable urbanization can result in higher risk of zoonosis and uncontrolled propagation. So I want to call your attention to an article that came out by the 4 leading scientists who produced the global assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The Secretariat invited them to make to publish an article regarding these connections between health and biodiversity. And I want to talk to you about 3 of the interesting conclusions in this discussion. The first one is that any post-pandemic economic crisis recovery package needs to decrease the future risk of those zoonoses by using integrative approaches. We need to promote technological and social approaches that aim for the longer-term sustainability of those dependencies. It's not just about eliminating wet markets. Wet markets provide jobs to people. They provide natural, healthy food to people. We need to manage that so that the benefits continue and that any risks can be minimized, including through the conservation of biodiversity. Healthy nature in cities brings health to urban citizens. This is why the second point in this article is to look at the proposed One Health approach, which is being outlined by the World Health Organization, and there is a task force behind it in Glading, working with a number of other UN agencies. Those recognize the complex interactions between the health of people in cities, animals, plants, and our shared environment. And these considerations need to be incorporated into urban development policies and programs and practices, in fact, at all levels, from the global to the most local. So this should also be considered, by the way, in the upcoming sessions of the UN General Assembly, which will be looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and a lot of other important issues. The third conclusion of this article is that there is a need to invest more on results-oriented research on the connections between the sustainable use and pandemic risk for the decision makers today. We can see that the thing is complex. There are many aspects. So how exactly can zoonosis and pandemics as human challenges, they're not a threat, that comes just now. They will continue to live with us. And they're not a threat from nature. They are a problem of us knowing too little about those interactions. So we need to do research to take corrective action. Those are the 3 lessons from this article that I wanted to share with you. And it's very clear that as key players in the UN system, national governments, what we call the parties, need to cooperate with all the other players to focus on science-based analysis to avoid the risk of zoonosis and the degradation of nature. So we will continue to work and help to share with you some of the lessons in that. So thank you very much for your attention.
There is one little short concluding remark Oliver wanted to make, which I will play now.
So as a conclusion to that initial discussion, I would like to invite the group in this webinar to consider how exactly you can read the recommendations from the international health and environment sectors and correlate the scientific information that is coming and the latest scientific findings so that we can formulate recommendations to the parties, to the national governments, and to the other stakeholders that are developing the global biodiversity framework, as well as all of those components on resource mobilization, on mainstreaming, on capacity building. We need to know how subnational local governments can help us in improving the decision-making processes for the conference, the 15th conference in China, and health, the links between biodiversity, urban health, and the control of the risks and the optimization of the benefits of interaction with nature will be the crucial elements there. Thank you for your attention.
Great. I just want to extend in his absence a huge thank you to Oliver for being present with us virtually. It's amazing what we can do with technology these days. And I think to pick up on a few keywords from Oliver's presentation, what's increasingly coming up are the words interdependencies, integration, and this speaks and enhances what Ingrid was saying about the need to mainstream nature. So on that note, I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce David Maddox, the Executive Director of the Nature of Cities. And David is a creative. He sort of works at the nexus of practice and theatre and music. And David founded the Nature of Cities in 2012, and as I've said, is its executive director. And the Nature of Cities is a transdisciplinary essay and discussion site with about just over 800 contributors from around the world. And David brings a very fresh and exciting perspective to the conversation, and we'll be expanding a little bit from a very practical cities point of view. So David's unable to join us in person now, but will be live in this afternoon's webinar, and I will play a video from David for purposes of this.
Hi everyone, I'm David Maddox. I'm the Executive Director from the Nature of Cities. I live in New York, and that's where I'm calling from today. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I really appreciate Ickley, longtime friends of Nature of Cities. Nature of Cities, very briefly, is a network of 800 or so contributors from around the world who are interested in cities that are better for both people and nature. Architects, artists, ecologists, social scientists, activists, practitioners, all interested in creating cities that are more resilient, sustainable, livable, and just. Everything is different now with COVID. We're all struggling to find some establishment of new routines, new normals. And I was invited here today to talk about this idea of urban nature and health in particular. So I appreciate the chance to talk with you today. One of the things that we know is that we believe that nature has benefit. And so I want to challenge everybody on this call the question: do we truly believe in the benefits of nature? Do we believe in the health benefits of nature? Do we believe in the benefits to biodiversity? Broad benefits that we talk about all the time. Well, there are a number of things that we know we can do to act on this belief if we truly believe in these benefits. We need to make sure that to try to continue to find ways that we can bring the idea of nature forward in the conversation about urban planning and the way we create cities. Not because it's just a nice to have, but because it's a critical to have, not only for biodiversity, but for the people who live in cities. It's critically important that we act on our beliefs of nature. So I want to make a couple of key points today in my brief talk. One is that we have broad evidence that access to nature has health benefits. Clean air and clean water, the provision of food, recovery and restoration, recovery for people in hospitals, people who are suffering from depression, lower stress, happiness, all are demonstrated and clear benefits of access to nature. Number two, access to these benefits is wildly inequitable around the world and across cities, whether you're in the United States or Europe or Africa or South America or Asia. Wild inequitability in the access to nature. During COVID, people crave parks, but unfortunately you're lucky if you have one near you to enjoy and be restored by. And third, I think we're all having the intensely personal thoughts about this idea, what will the new normal be? And I'd like to make the point that let's hope it isn't exactly like the old normal. Now, one of the things I want to say is that I don't want to be over enthusiastic about the idea of nature returning to cities. It's great. I love hearing the birds, less traffic, less consumption, all of these things. But I do want to pause and say, as a person who's emerged from the performing arts, and that there are whole industries, things that we love about cities, which are simply not going to be the same again for a long time. There is an immense amount of suffering and hardship. So I don't want to seem too happy about the idea of the return of nature, because we need to recognize that many people are suffering. But let's talk about how nature can be a positive thing going forward in the new cities that we are after. Because we want to make sure that we don't simply return to everything that was normal before, because we know that the old normal was a large part of the problem. Now, not everyone's going to agree with that statement, but I think that's a good place to start as a negotiation about the idea of where do we go from here. And it turns out the old normal can change. This is a quote from Diane Pataki, a professor at the University of Utah, who wrote in the Nature of Cities recent roundtable on COVID. For years, she's been told all kinds of things. So, no, we can't do this. No, we can't change this administrative feature. No, we can't have flex time for employees. No, no, no. Well, in terms of in COVID, it turned out we changed immense things, big things, important things, and we changed them within weeks. So next time we have a good idea, Diane Pataki's recommendation is, next time we have a daring solution for something, let's not so quickly take no for an answer, because we know change is possible. Let's imagine the thing that we want, that we need, the cities that we deserve, and act toward moving toward those things. All right, let's go back to the idea of nature and parks. What can we change? And I think the first thing we can change is the idea of access. And I want to point out a fantastic program in the United States that's run by the Trust for Public Land. In that program, they are working to create partnerships with cities to make sure that every person in the city is within a 10-minute walk of the park, about a half a kilometer of the park. I think that it's a remarkable target to have for any city around the world, because it's a something we can plan toward, we can act toward, and we can also measure our progress toward that goal into the future. A fantastic way to address that kind of question is through the idea of linear parks or corridor parks, long and skinny parks. And there's a lot of interest in this idea around the world. Here's some pictures of some classic linear parks from around the world. And the point I want to make about linear parks is, if the question that is being posed is, how do we create more access for people? How do we create access to parks for more people? Then a linear park is a really good answer. It's not the answer to every green and open space question you might have, but the question of access, it's a really important answer. Why? Because it cuts through more neighborhoods. We know this is a big issue around the world. There's a crisis of open space in the world cities for all kinds of competing reasons. Some of those reasons have to do with things that we can actively change, and some of them also have to do with the lack of space in dense cities. How can we make progress toward providing this goal of more access to parks and providing more of the health benefits of nature to more people? Let's talk a little bit more about this idea of creating linear parks that serve more people. An example I talk about a lot, because it's a beautiful example, is an example from Mumbai. This is the work of architect P.K. Das in Mumbai. He describes himself as an architect and activist. There are these water courses in Mumbai, a number of them. They're called nullas, and over time they started as drainage for the number of rivers that flowed through the city originally. Over time, they've become dumps. They've become dirty, inaccessible. They are walled off, fenced off. Garbage is thrown in them. PK's idea has been, let's green those nullas to make them more accessible to more people. So you can see he's successfully greened a number of these. The middle picture, you can see some examples of the work that he's created in the nullas. And in the bottom picture, you can see the nullas snaking through a number of neighborhoods. And that's the key to seeing its benefits, both for health and particularly for access, because it cuts through more neighborhoods and attaches to more people. So I like to talk about this idea of justice and geometry with respect to corridor parks. That is, that the idea of long, skinny parks create more access to parks, create more just, equitable access to parks because of their geometry. Let's imagine, as an example, just a couple of different shapes of things. I think you should be start to see some different shapes of green spaces, from square ones to long and skinny ones. So the one on the square one, if an area of 4, all these 3 shapes have the same area, 4, but they differ in their amount of perimeter. The square one has a perimeter of 8. The long and skinny one on the right has a perimeter of 17. How many people have access to those parks if you ask how many people live within 10 minutes or a half kilometer of that park? I call that the people catchment area. So the square park has a people catchment area of only 2.5, whereas the long and skinny park has a catchment area of 4.5. Simple-minded geometry, which suggests that the long and skinny park has potential as a provider of more equitable access. The long and skinny one, per unit area of park, has a bigger catchment area. It's closer to more people because it cuts across neighborhoods. Well, what are some examples of that in actual cities? Here are some data from citymayors.com, just harvested from the internet. We can look at a bunch of cities around the world, different sizes and different densities, from Mumbai to New York, Seoul, Rio, Bogota. You can do this for any cities, and you can see how many people would be served by a park that was long and skinny, a park that was 5 kilometers by a half a kilometer. Mumbai, it's 180,000 people, given the density of that city. New York, 42,000, Seoul, 100,000, Rio, 41,000. This is an expression of the people catchment area around a long and skinny park like this. Well, how big a park, how big a square park would it take to serve that many people? Again, it's just geometry based on the density of these cities. It would take a park 3 kilometers, a square park 3 kilometers per side. Now, how many people on this call have the possibility of creating a park in your city that is 3 kilometers on a side? Probably nobody, right? Nobody. And so that's the other interesting thing about long and skinny parks like this, that they are targets of opportunity. That is, that we can find spaces in cities that we might be able to create these long and skinny parks along creeks, along road corridors, other aspects of the geography, the topology of the city. So these are the important things that connect back to the idea of health and reimagining, recommitting ourselves to what kind of normal do we want to create in the future. And I believe that normal needs to create more access to parks, more access to green space, and an answer to that is the idea of creating long and linear parks, both because they are effective as creators of more access, and also because they actually have opportunities to create such parks in many cities around the world. And I'd like to leave you with a thought from another contributor from our COVID roundtable, The Nature of Cities, Mary Rowe, who runs the Canadian Urban Institute in Toronto. And I'm just going to read it to you because I find it very moving. I think the most profound challenge for any of us working in urbanism through and after COVID is that now that we see how our cities truly function at their most vulnerable, what possible excuse do we now have not to emerge solely committed to fixing it? I think that's a powerful message for as we see the issues that have confronted us with COVID, the things that they have uncovered about how our cities are not working for us in terms of health, in terms of food provision, in terms of green space, in terms of jobs, prosperity, and equity. We have a new challenge for ourselves to create a new normal, a new post-COVID normal that works better for everyone. Thank you very much.
Great. Also, in David's absence, I want to just extend a huge thank you for his willingness to participate. I think, he's really brought a very fresh perspective to the conversation, and certainly issued us with a challenge that we all need to think about in terms of how we emerge from the COVID pandemic, and how we create and design and build our cities in the future. So it's really great to see as well the issues of access to park space and green open spaces in cities coming to the fore at this time. And I think our previous panelists have predominantly focused on the link between nature and health. We're going to shift gears slightly now as well to start looking at and bringing in a third aspect, and that's really around food and nutrition. And just to let you know, this webinar is part of a series, and we hope to bring this conversation even stronger in the next webinars. But we're really excited to start having this conversation on food and nutrition as it relates to nature and health. And to do that, I'm really thrilled to introduce my colleague, Paul Curry. And Paul he works at ICLEI Africa in the urban systems team, and he's a researcher of African urban resource and service systems with a real interest in quantitative analysis, with storytelling and connecting that analysis with visual elicitation. So Paul, we are thrilled to have you online, and thank you for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to you to take us through some of your thoughts and reflections in terms of nature, and we're moving towards food and nutrition now. So thanks, Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Tim, and hello to everyone on the call. I'm really excited to be joining these deliberations. When asked to draw together these very large questions of health, nutrition, food, and nature, the obvious word that must jump out is nexus. And when we think about nexus, the aim is to try and work out how we can reduce the co-impacts across different sectors. So how we can make sure that when we invest in food systems, we're not undermining nature, we're not undermining other sectors in our cities. And when we invest in a nexus, we try to look for co-benefits. So how can we see benefits across different sectors emerge through direct and purposeful interventions? So that's kind of the ethos of approaching these large themes together. The unit that I'm in at ICLEI Africa is urban systems. We support local and subnational governments to think about how different aspects and systems in their cities are interconnected, and how they can leverage, for example, cross-financing to support efforts across departments in the cities for wider benefits. So the title of my presentation is Healthy Food and Healthy Nature. And I think if there's one key takeaway that I would like to leave you with, it's how food can be a driver of including more nature into urban spaces. Next one, please, Tim. So when we approach food, there are three lenses that we tend to use. The first is the very typical approach of a value chain. So on the left, we can go at the top from food production through aggregation, distribution, through processing to add value and make sure that our food could be stored for longer times, through to markets where it can be accessed by consumers, where it is consumed, that is where food offers the nutritional benefits for people. And then all along the food value chain, there is associated food loss. So already this diagram is suggesting we should be trying to recover materials from that to re-embed into the system. So this way of approaching food shows you where you can intervene along a value chain for different outcomes. The next lens is a food security lens, and we tend to kind of throw around food security as a term quite easily. But the way this is conceptualized quite well is through these pillars of food security, of availability. Are we producing enough food so that our citizens aren't going hungry? Access, are people actually able to access the food that we're producing? So this has to do with the cost of the food, market accessibility. David has talked about whether we're able to access parks. So similarly, are people able to access nutritious food? And then finally, utilization reflects on how we turn food into nourishment. And that's both in our bodies. Are we able to digest and take nutrients out of the food that we're ingesting? But also to the wider system. What chemicals have been used either to fertilize or to protect from pests? What quality of food you're taking? Are you having a full diet, balanced diet on your plate with different food groups and things like that? And finally, stability is most resonant to our current situation, where we ask the question, are availability, access, and utilization able to withstand shocks to the system? such as a pandemic which reshapes our global food supply chain, such as increased traffic in a city which reduces the ability of food transport to move quickly, and that has repercussions on food safety. Finally, our other lens is looking through a policy approach. How do you use food to connect different departments and improve nutritional outcomes and health outcomes? So here we see a department looking at public health, the waste departments, economic departments, people engaged with food safety, security and access, and of course, very importantly, our environmental departments connected to climate change and environmental degradation. So if you want to improve the food system, it requires the participation of all of these groups across the government and the wider stakeholders. So in a conversation around food, health, nature, and nutrition, these two FAO documents are quite useful to look at. The first Ingrid has mentioned is mainstreaming biodiversity across sectors. And this is important given the demonstration that biodiversity leads to higher quality and amounts of food produced. But then the way in which we structure our agriculture production can improve biodiversity outcomes. For example, if we take on agroecology as an approach, we're finding ways to grow our produce without huge chemical inputs and in ways that regenerate soils and allow many different types of species of food, plant, and other flora and fauna to participate in that system. The other document is the FAO framework for the urban food agenda, which is quite useful in plotting out a number of key interventions. Next slide, please. So here are 7 approaches suggested by the FAO as a pathway to improving food systems in our cities. Going from the bottom, taking a territorial approach as suggested in the new urban agenda of 2016, where we acknowledge urban-rural linkages and the role they have in bringing food to the city. Integrated food system planning, as mentioned above when we're talking about food policies, how are we including multiple voices and multiple sectors in the conversation about food. Then the implementation, kind of the green offering there, short food supply chains. A lot of people now are talking about proximity production as a way to establish new food systems that don't rely on wide global food chains. Innovating for agri-food businesses. This is a great way to build economies in what they suggest should be small towns, but across many urban spaces. Our conversation today is looking at food and green environments for healthy cities. My translation of that could be using food as an excuse for embedding green space in a city. So if we're having difficulty convincing different sectors to invest or protect biodiversity when there are competing interests of housing, industry that is taking over green space, we can suggest that food is the action and the economic activity that is legitimately using the space, while of course having other mixed uses of nature. So similarly to what David has proposed of long parks, there are concepts of foodways in which you can have different food crops as part of recreational parks, building social engagement in that. Then also optimized supply chains and circular bioeconomy, particularly in the global south, where much of the waste that impacts our ecosystems is related to food. In Africa, about 60 to 70% of waste that makes its way into rivers and clogs storm drains is organic, let alone the food-associated wastes such as plastics. So instead of simply disposing of them in a landfill, how do we utilize those wastes either as new inputs into the food system and to build new economies, such as through bio-based packaging, which also serves the food system. Finally, what we're doing now is expanding the reach for global urban food governance, so sharing these ideas across countries and cities. So we are currently participating in this image. Next slide, please, Tim. So when asked to speak, I was musing if I could present this in a systems map. Unfortunately, I don't think I have enough time to walk you through it, but do suggest that you can look at the recording of this for a bit more depth, but this is a causal loop diagram, which effectively shows the positive and negative causes. So as an example of how this works, we can start at the bottom with quality green space. The more quality green space I have, if we move left, the better my biodiversity outcomes are. And then that's actually a reinforcing loop. If I have good biodiversity, the quality of my green space will improve. So even by just investing in good green space in your cities, you can improve biodiversity outcomes. If we follow from biodiversity to the top middle, we can have positive benefits of the amount and the quality of food produced, which, if we continue moving right, improves our health, mental and physical, because we are eating good foods. And similarly, if we go from the bottom, quality green space, we can improve health, both mental and physical, as David has shown quite effectively. Next slide, please. So in summary, these are some of the ideas which were explored in the discussion. Effectively, we want to improve connectivity in nature for greater biodiversity outcomes. If we use mixed-use public space planning, we can provide more opportunities for urban food gardening. We can use urban agriculture, food gardens, and foodways as an excuse to introduce more nature into cities. Urban gardening has great social outcomes, including mental health. We also see circular resource systems to redesign or repurpose wastes for new livelihoods and good impacts on green space. Territorial planning must acknowledge rural and urban interlinkages, both for acknowledging migration, but also for building economies and supporting a wider territorial growth. For all of this, when we talk about food, multi-level governance is required, including multiple stakeholders through many different approaches. And finally, leveraging cross-departmental financing can be very useful. So approaching a traffic department who might be investing in beautification on the side of the roads and saying, hey, why don't we beautify with food crops or with other types of nature? I'll pause there and thank you very much.
Great, a huge thank you to you, Paul. I think also a really innovative perspective. It's great that systems map is very useful, and we will be sharing this presentation, so you will have access to that to look at it in more detail after the webinar. But a huge thank you to you, Paul, for highlighting these critical linkages and to, really you had a difficult job to sort of bring it all together, and I think you covered it very well. So thank you for being with us. We really appreciate it. Just as we come to close, I just want to remind everyone and encourage everyone on the webinar, if you haven't already, to join and take a look at Cities with Nature, where we are starting to move into these more Nexus approaches, and where we will soon have service offerings available for our cities to start embarking on journeys that are centered around nature, health, and food. Just to draw your attention, we are running out of time, so I'm going to quickly open the floor if there are any questions and discussion points at this point. I know that we don't have David and Oliver live at this point, but we do have Ingrid and Paul, so time is very short, but if there are any burning questions, you can either raise your hand in the panel on the right or make use of the chat box. I'll just wait for a few seconds to see if there is a question, and I'll ask my colleague Julia to just let me know if there are any hands raised.
I don't see any hand raised now.
Okay, that's great. And we encourage you to write to us should you have any questions at a later stage. Our details are on your screen now. And I think with that, I'd like to just again thank our amazing panelists, especially to David and to Paul for being with us. Your perspectives have really, shone a light on the interconnections between these very, very important topics, and it's great that we're starting to explore this more Nexus approach. So thank you for being with us and taking the time. And again, a huge thank you to Ingrid and Oliver. And we look forward to seeing and hearing you all in this afternoon's webinar at 3 p.m. South African Standard Time, or GMT+2. So join us there. If not, we look forward to seeing you in the following webinar, and the details for the following webinar will be shared in the follow-up email. So with that, it's my pleasure to close the webinar and to again In closing, just thank all of the participants for being with us today and for taking the time to be with us. So stay well and stay healthy, and we will be in touch and connect again soon. Thanks, everyone.